And this is going to be a real treat. Our rules of engagement are very simple. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just introduce themselves, talk a word or two about their current work in creating cybersecurity. You'll hear some different angles to it, and then we're just going to open it up for questions, comments, and a discussion about anything and everything that we've talked about today. And I think we have about 30 minutes to do that. So with that, I'm going to ask my good friend Corey to kick it off.
A pleasure. Thank you very much. So Corey Thomas, I'm the CEO of Rapid7. We're a data analytics and cybersecurity firm. And our real focus is helping organizations really understand their information and data. What we find is that one of the biggest threats in cybersecurity is that IT is poorly managed. And that's what people exploit. We don't update our systems. We don't monitor our systems. We don't do a good job of understanding how well we run and operationalize our own IT and technology environment. And so at Rapid7, we focus on helping companies gather all the data they need to really understand the state of their entire IT ecosystem at any moment in time, and then focus on managing and prioritizing threats, vulnerabilities, and detecting attacks.
Corey, can I, before we jump off to our next panelist, can I just ask you to say a word about how big your enterprise is right now?
Yeah, we have about 6,500 customers around the world today. We operate in about 80 countries, and we serve both commercial clients as well as governmental clients.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Allison.
Terrific. Hi. So I'm Allison Gudet. I'm the CEO of G2 Web Services. We're based in Seattle, Washington, but our client base is very global. We tackle the challenge that we're going to be talking about from a little bit of a different vantage point than the other panelists. We help financial institutions, largely acquiring banks and their whole value chain, technology companies that have payments capabilities and commercial banks, to ensure that the merchants or business customers to which they're providing payment capabilities aren't engaging in illegal or brand damaging activity. So at the end of the day, we really see ourselves as the cops of the internet, and we help to keep e-commerce safe and profitable for our customers and frankly for all of us. So the types of illegal content and crimes that we're detecting aren't generally honeypot schemes where merchants are just siphoning card data, although that does happen. Our main focus is going to be counterfeit goods, sale of illegal drugs, sale of hard drugs. And let me tell you, the online sale of drugs is the #1 problem that we face on my part of the industry now. Online sales have surpassed street sales in 2016 by a fair bit, actually, as well as child endangerment material, illegal sexual content, hate content, but also terrorism financing.
So you're presumably working very closely with law enforcement as well?
You know, it's an interesting question. On topics of child endangerment, yes. Always have been very focused on sexual exploitation of children, and when we detect online exploitative content of children, that gets reported to law enforcement first.
Good for you.
And happily, because of our work, the card networks, and also the diligent work of our clients, it's quite difficult today to purchase child endangerment material today using a credit card. But there are many, many ways to get around protections. And of course, that's the challenge I think that we all face. No matter what blocks or protections or monitoring you're setting up, the bad actors need access to payments, and so they're going to circumvent them, and we have to continue to evolve those capabilities. In the other areas, we report our violations to our banking clients, and then they decide whether to take legal action.
Got it. Thanks, Allison. Blake.
Sure. Blake Hall, I'm the founder and CEO of IDme. I think the statistic that stands out the most to me for cybersecurity, Verizon releases an annual report that many of you will be familiar with on data breaches, and 63% of data breaches happen because a login is compromised, whether it is stolen or whether it is phished. And so why is that the case? A lot of the breaches that the Admiral talked about, the Russian interference with our election, at least when it came to John Podesta, they didn't do kind of deep nerd stuff and hack Google. They hacked his login because he didn't have multi-factor authentication enabled, and they got his password. The OPM breach, which compromised all of our national security professionals and our military community, happened because an administrator only had a password protecting access to all of that information. The Anthem healthcare breach that happened, 78.8 million Americans' names, dates of birth, and socials happened because you had an administrator's credential that only was protected by a password. And so there is this trade-off between security and usability. The average American today on the internet manages over 100 different logins. And unless you're a supercomputer, you have two choices, besides a password manager, which I think only like 12 to 13% of Americans use, so I'll set that aside for a moment. You can either write all of your passwords down and put them in a drawer somewhere, or you can reuse the same 2 or 3 passwords over and over again. And if you're guilty of that, like I am, what happens if the administrator for Anthem is part of the Yahoo breach, and he's using the same password at work that he's using in his personal life? So clearly, you have to solve the usability issues around authentication, and that'll feed back into better security. And so General McChrystal, who's over in Iraq when I was maybe the G.I. Joe guy, working with a lot of the cyber folks who were supporting us, famously said it takes a network to defeat a network. You have to have a network of good guys. And so what we're doing with federal agencies right now, financial institutions, and a bunch of retailers, we're one of 4 companies in the United States that's certified to issue a digital login that's actually a legal form of identification. We've been audited by the General Services Administration. We're part of InStick, if the audience is familiar with InStick. The other providers, I think, are Verizon, Symantec, and Athena Health. And so our notion is that in the physical world, for in-person transactions, state DMVs provide a credential, the driver's license, that is the national form of identification. And it works. Even though there's many different DMVs, they're governed by the Real ID Act and everything else. So in this case, NIST has set standards, and we'd really encourage financial institution partners who are here in the audience, if you want to take this pool of trusted credentials, tens of millions of credentials, and extend them to federal agencies. Right now we're working with the VA, the IRS, Treasury, the state of Maine, that citizens could actually authenticate with a trusted login that they already have, so that financial services can be stewards of our online identity instead of Facebook and Google, which, no offense to them, are advertising companies and should not be the de facto providers of national identity. So in some respects, we want to see an internet where you can pick the identity provider of your choice, whether it's the United States Postal Service, IDme, or a telecom, and then you can take your identity and your personal data with you, your legal identity, to open up a bank account, to access your Social Security benefits, to authenticate a payment if you happen to be traveling and CIF science says you're a bad guy and you're really not a bad guy, right? How do you let consumers take back control of their identity so that they can prove who they are while they're online? And I think that all of those themes, if you can solve usability and give people control over their own data, you're going to see a substantial reduction in the amount of data breaches that are happening.
Can I just bounce one question, and
Sure.
then we'll go to Sunil?
Yeah.
And that's biometrics. Do you see that at some point, or is that sort of pie in the sky at this point? Or
I think biometrics are fascinating. I'm sure Sunil's going to have some really good comments on biometrics as well. But the folks at Dayon are right down the street, and they're working with some of the largest networks and issuing banks out there. What was really surprising to me is that older Americans actually love taking selfies, and so the adoption and the uptake.
they love Facebook. That's the biggest demographic on Facebook is 45 to 55.
Yeah, we actually identified that people as old as 70 years old have online presence. And they're usually voyeuristic because they kind of look at their grandchildren growing up on these social networks and so on.
Yeah. So no, I think biometrics are absolutely a part of the future. I think particularly in the developing world, where there are no records, financial records, government records, utility records, biometrics are often a great place to start with the establishment of an official identity that you can then have observation points that create reputation. But absolutely a huge part of the ecosystem that's to come, in my opinion.
And Sunil, wrap us up.
Sure. I run Socure. We're a predictive analytics platform for identity verification, and we uniquely combine online, offline, and social information together to provide identity assurance and to allow businesses generally to sign up more good customers, increasing acceptance, while keeping the bad people, the fraudsters, out and reducing cost of compliance. We primarily service, just like G2, financial services companies, Tier 1 and Tier 2, along with the bureaus. The angle here generally is that 5.5 billion people in the world have no identity, either because they are young and they've moved away from credit behavior, so they're referred to as thin file. And then the majority of the world that doesn't have access to credit, who live on cash. All of these people have a problem in inclusion because they don't have identity, or they have very poor identifiers that kind of stand in the way of identifying risks. So we operate in that space, and we use predictive analytics uniquely to give better outcomes in these different areas. The intersection of our business with cybersecurity is really one in multi-factor authentication and authentication in general. The general problem is that when human beings authenticate to machines, we often use credentials, and no matter what the credentials are, whether they're a user ID and password or whether they're your fingerprint or your face, at the end of the day, you can't trust an authenticator or a credential without having assurance that the identity has been proved and verified. So we kind of focus on that side of the shop, if you will. We talk about cybersecurity, and often the conversations kind of focus on technology, but we all know that people, process, and technology are all part of the issue. We focus on technological threat landscape because that spans everything from infrastructure to applications to data. We often don't focus on people or process. And if the attacker knows the process, that's a much more effective attack vector than the technology, which can always change. Because the process changes are few and far between.
Terrific. I'm going to ask one question for each of the panelists to answer, because I think it does cut across all of what you're doing and probably is of interest. And then after that, I'll just sort of look out into the audience and look for someone to raise their hand and ask your question, and please identify yourself. The question I have for all of you is, I talked a bit about the government and its need for cyber talent, cyber force. All of you are running dynamic companies that are constantly in the fight for talent. How does it, and I'm going to start right here with Corey, and we'll go right back down. How are you approaching getting the bright young men and women you need, Corey? And how tough is the competition out there? Because I'll tell you, from a government perspective, it's brutal, because it's the government, and I would much rather be working for the four of you than working for me. So, Corey, how hard is the fight, and what are you doing about it?
What's funny, I actually think that everyone belatedly realized they were behind, so everyone pillaged the government, which is part of what caused the issue. I would say that in some ways we actually learned from the government, so it's not actually hard, but we actually have a very specific approach, and it's an old one, is you develop talent.
Yeah.
And there is a large supply of people, both in the US and around the world, but what you have to have is the capacity to develop and educate talent, both about technology and about cybersecurity. But I would say that increasingly, the education isn't so much the hard part about the technology, it's about educating about the process, so to speak, and the human behavioral aspects of it. Because when we think about cybersecurity, it is someone that understands both technology, but also they understand processes, and they understand people, and the people's probably the most, I would say, the hardest to train aspect of it, but it's one of the most valuable. In general, I think that it is a very acute pain in the cybersecurity workforce today. It is acute because it requires deep expertise, and it's almost mathematically impossible to actually get the depth of expertise that we're going to need anytime soon. But the solution, I would say, is obvious, is that we have to make cybersecurity solvable by people that actually have a generalized skill set.
Yeah.
And so you can either say you're going to actually add a lot more experts, which I would argue in no domain is that ever a scalable solution.
Yeah.
Or you can say you lower the expertise required to be successful. And so you can make a larger mass of society successful. And that's certainly at Rapid7, our focus is how do we actually take the complexity out of managing and understanding and analyzing cybersecurity. But in general, I would say that that's going to have to be a focus of many parts of the ecosystem, is how do you remove complexity and simplify how do you actually manage cybersecurity risk.
Thanks, Corey. Allison, how about from your perspective?
So we share a labor market with Amazon and Microsoft.
Ooh,
so finding technologists and data scientists is always challenging. I think the way we approach it is a couple of things. One, the work we do is incredibly compelling to a lot of people. That you can make money by doing societal good is a driver of both recruiting and also retention. The second is we're moving, I think probably like all the folks here on the stage, but maybe not always like the behemoth firms that we might compete with, really, really quickly. The types of technological challenges that we're attempting to address as fraudsters continue to adapt their strategies means that the work from G2's side of the house can be pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And pretty dynamic. And then we have a culture of tremendous flexibility, so we don't have all of our employees located in Bellevue, Washington, and we allow people to work pretty much whatever crazy schedule they wish. For some of them, it's literally overnight, and that's okay. But I think at the end of the day, it's the work that we do is a driver, and the fact that we're solving really hard, complicated data problems with cutting-edge technology.
Got it. Blake.
Sure. So I think people fundamentally have two different types of motivations: extrinsic or intrinsic. The government has a really hard time competing with extrinsic motivators like money. As well, you know that better than I do, sir. As an admiral, I got out a lot earlier than you did. But what the government does have is it has a monopoly on violence. So the pictures that you popped up there earlier, those folks went to jail for a while, and so for people who are motivated that way, I think that's terrific. I think as a private sector company, one of the ways that we sort of compete with the intrinsic motivation is by having a really powerful mission. And our mission is that individuals need to have agency over their own data so that they can more effectively prove who they are online.
Sure.
And when we're competing with other contractors in the DC area who are doing legacy database integration, part of my thesis about moving the company to DC was, do you want to put your grandkid on your knee and tell them about some legacy database integration you did, or do you want to build Visa for identity, where people can pick a credential of their choice and take it with them across the web, and it changes the way that we interact online. So having that's important. Credibility of leadership is really important. I've got to be really good at what I do. Our CTO is actually Estonian, so comes from
Good choice.
Yeah. And he's brilliant. So that certainly helps. But I think one thing, to echo your point on a cyber force to complement the other branches of the military, is that the government suffers because it is too hierarchical right now, and tech is very flat.
Yeah, of course.
And for people who want autonomy, especially in the tech world, I think the average age at Facebook and Google is like 29 or 30.
Sure.
And they're building self-driving cars and everything else. If you went into the service right now, as a lieutenant, you have very little responsibility. Well, you have more responsibility relative, but you can't have Zuckerberg-like authority by the time that you're 30.
Yeah.
And until the government figures out that autonomy challenge, but maybe a cyber force would be a good way for them to help.
Yeah, just to bounce off that, I would picture a cyber force as not being, shave your head, build up your muscles, and join the Marine Corps, but there's going to have to be flexibility in personnel management and personnel systems, which all four of you are doing.
Yep.
Sunil, thoughts on this?
I'm going to take a different stance. I think people are important. Generally speaking, I'm a geek, so I'll speak from a geek's perspective. Geeks like cool shit to do. So, if you're going to go work as a quant in a hedge fund, or you're working on some newer technology, it's actually going to make a big impact in the world. Geeks love that stuff. So, I think innovation is key, and we are seeing pockets of innovation in the United States. And as a country, we're very good at innovating because we also have the capital expenditure that we dedicate towards venture and sort of fostering startups who take risks. That's part of it, but generally speaking, I think that I would side on the trend towards having fewer people. The reason is that a lot of the stuff we talk about, even in cybersecurity, especially when you talk about cybersecurity for an enterprise, right? An enterprise that's been in business for 50, 60 years, 100 years, they've grown up with a mix of heterogeneous software, process, technology, devices, et cetera. And so the threat landscape is pretty kind of wide. So machines today offer us the capability to take data coming from all of these disparate sources that human beings might not intuitively piece together. I joke, for example, a machine looking at 5 different data sources might find that a 30-year-old with a mustache who likes vodka is correlated to fraud. Now, that's not something that the human person is going to tease out of the data. So we've got all of these disparate systems producing a large amount of data. We could refer to it as big data. Processing that, looking for patterns is part of the challenge here in cybersecurity, and machines are very good at that. So we are on the side of having fewer people automating more stuff. So for example, when we talk about data science, it isn't the process of human being taking data and doing engineering and then creating models and deploying the models. It's human beings creating machines that do that work.
Sure.
So we can operate at much larger scale with much better accuracy and efficiency with fear of the risks.
Fair enough. I'll close this segment by one thing that none of you mentioned, but is sort of foundational, which is STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, education. And I often these days talk about STEM-C, which is cyber. You shouldn't be, my view, you shouldn't be able to get out of junior high school unless you can code at some level. Shouldn't get out of high school unless you can explain the internet minute. And all of that becomes foundational to doing the kind of things that R7 is doing, which is simplifying it because it's instinctual for you, the digital native theory of life. Well, let me open it up. We've got a few minutes for questions. I have one right here, sir. I'll take a quick, go ahead.
If you want to start.
No, you.
Well, part of the challenge between security and privacy is how much information we have to expose about ourselves before we feel uncomfortable. The reality is that we do not need to expose 100% of ourselves in every context, because at the end of the day, when you're trying to do things like authentication, identity verification, et cetera, it's based on the context of the risk. The least amount of risk, the less friction in the path of the consumer. The higher the risk, the more things you throw in the path of the consumer. So it's really a question of, what type of information do we share or need to share for what type of context of transaction. And that can vary. A citizen to government use case is different from a citizen to a bank, for example. So really I think the fear is that as we collect more and more information about ourselves, and these pieces of information are stored in private and public enterprise, what are we doing to guard that information? To the use case earlier from the OPM hack, fingerprints are stolen. You can't change your fingerprint, right? So I think creating kind of standards for control of that data is important, and understanding what minimal amount of data you can actually require to authorize a particular transaction, or based on the context of the request. I think that's the key. Simplifying the path for the consumer. So we use, for example, analytics to do that. How do you piece together sparse information about people with their consent, which is the most important thing, in the context of that transaction, in order to facilitate that transaction?
Good. Let me ask if there are other quick hitter comments, and we'll just.
Well, first, I just want to applaud the FIDO Alliance as well for all the work that they've done, specifically with tokens, so that you can use strong authenticators, and they've built in things that prevent linkability and traceability, so there is privacy by design that are built into many of those products. We're imminently about to launch native FIDO U2F capabilities that the federal government can take advantage of those things. How do you do multi-factor authentication for a senior citizen who doesn't have a smartphone, right? Especially because biometrics, to be delivered securely, have to be delivered through a client-side device. Well, that's where things like security keys and what Yubico is doing as a member of the FIDO Alliance is really, really important. So when you talk about security and access, particularly for demographics that are maybe at a particular disadvantage, are rural Americans, homeless Americans, homeless veterans, having optionality among authenticators can actually increase access, security, and privacy all at the same time if you're working with great organizations like FIDO.
Thanks. Others? Allison and then Corey?
Just to point a little bit of a different vantage point on the question. One area where we would like there to be more aggressive policy is with regard to laws, especially in the U.S., around how easy it is to build a shell or a shelf company, and for bad actors to hide as beneficial owners of those businesses. One of the areas where the U.S. has begun to implement new policy, but the implementation life cycle on it is very long. and it's very, very gradual. The EU has taken a much more aggressive position, and it's a much safer environment for the payments ecosystem as a result.
Got it. Corey, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would just say, like any policy, I think policies have to be simple and consumable in lots of ways. And I think the principle that we have to do has to carry over, and it's that in general, the individual needs to have control over what information they share, and a very minimal set of information should be compulsory. And I think the question in lots of ways comes down, who can compel what type of information and how much information can be compelled. And I think that there are some cases where that's valid, but it should be a very small amount of information. As you say, it's not all or nothing, and the individual should have as much control, and it should be as transparent as possible.
Yeah, when I address this with, if you will, a lay audience, I'll often say, this question is not an on and off switch.
Exactly.
The choices are not you're totally exposed and naked out there, or no, the government can't know anything about you. It's a rheostat. I think Corey's got it about right. The rheostat needs to be dialed toward privacy, but there's going to be some amount of light that you have to have in order to have a functioning society. Other questions? Oh, right up here, and sir, we need a microphone for this gentleman. There you go. Careful. Yes, indeed. You're at Harvard. They have high liability insurance. You know.
Well, I have spoken to a couple of the panelists earlier at various times about the idea of identity. You know, I'm James Drake. I'm CEO of Embermine. We're working within the blockchain space, and there's some interesting developments that are occurring within that space. One of them is the idea between identity and like an entity that you would put out in the world that would be able to share only what information you want to share within certain spaces. What I'm interested in particular with the other two panelists I haven't spoken with is how important it is, in your opinion, that individuals not only be able to specifically identify themselves in a unique space, but also be able to share their information on their own terms, and how that relates with enforcement of in particular legal things, such as when we're talking about child endangerment and the drug trade on the internet, in particular in the blockchain space.
Good. Who would like to
I've spoken to James before, so
Yeah.
I think he wants to hear from the rest of you.
Good. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, so I'll jump in, and I'll rephrase the question. I want to make sure I capture the essence of it. But I think a big part of it is, how do you actually provide the individual control to decide what information they share, how they delegate information, and essentially what are the boundaries of when I use the term compelled, when someone else can actually demand information back from the individual. And I like the analogy that the Admiral gave about it's dialable in some cases. The basic belief that I have is, and I think you can borrow some stuff about sort of like the way we operate today, is that if you're going to actually participate in an ecosystem, total anonymity is not a healthy thing. And the reason total anonymity isn't a healthy thing is if you think about any ecosystem where you actually have crime, it actually happens in the shadows. So the more you actually have a broad shadow, the more bad things actually thrive. Now, the opposite extreme is also true, is that basically if not just every government, but every sort of corporation, every intimate has sort of like intimate details of all of our lives, that's a very bad space to actually be in too. And so the way that I tend to think about the answer to your question from a what can the government, which is where this question goes, allows a sort of compel people to actually do, is I think it can actually compel sort of like the identity of who are you that are actually using or accessing a service. The one that actually most question most commonly actually gets back to is that when can actually a government compel information and when can it actually acquire information, and what's the ability to actually get information that I've stored or I've placed in something else there. And my stance both publicly and privately has actually been relatively straightforward on the rights of governments to get information is it has to actually fulfill the transparency bar, meaning that we have a system and a process to say that we can actually subpoena, access, and do a whole bunch of other things there. And I think that that transparency and the process around it is incredibly important and sacrosanct in my mind.
I just want to add one thing, because we work very closely with the National Institute of Standards and Technology on this, part of the Department of Commerce. And so it's really important to talk about identity in the context of a particular domain and of a transaction to really grasp the principles of what we're talking about here. So fundamentally, identity is about establishing trust between two parties for a given transaction. Another way of saying that is it's mitigating risk to an acceptable level for that particular action or access decision to be made. But it's also about establishing uniqueness. You know, when we're talking to the VA about authenticating a physician or a healthcare provider or a patient, we need to authenticate legal identity. So what are the bundles of attributes of legal identity? It's your name, it's your date of birth, it's your social, it's your address, it's your phone number. Those are all the things that that government agency needs to give access to a patient to their medical records. For a physician, it's going to be all of those things, plus to know that the National Provider Index, which is the national registry of nurse practitioners and physicians and everything else. But those are the only pieces of data that that individual should have to put over. Whoever they're authenticating to, whether it's a bank, us, or a government agency that's the actual identity provider, they need to collect the minimal of information that allows them to verify uniqueness, but then they might only need that individual to send a claim over somewhere else. So as an example, we do student verification for hundreds of different retailers where, you know, how do you do a subsidized price point online for students if you aren't able to verify that a customer is a student? So when we collect data from them, there is no national student identifier. So we collect name, date of birth, their college or university, and the last four of their SSN, because that's the only way that you can prevent duplication of the identity. But when the individual's actually asked to authenticate to a retailer, they're only releasing their student status and their name, and the retailer's trusting us. And we're familiar with that, right? When we open up a bank account, for regulatory reasons, we have to provide our name, our date of birth, our address, our SSN, 304 for KYC. But
SSNs are non-unique, though. There are 40 million common SSNs.
But in conjunction with other attributes, you get to uniqueness. It's like if you have name, date of birth, and SSN, the odds of a duplicate match are in the billions for one identity. So once you've established that with a financial institution, when you're authenticating a transaction with Starbucks or whatever else, all they care about is, are you able to make this payment? Yeah. But the point is that attributes are really, really fascinating because there's almost nth number of them. It's from your favorite color to your social security number to your brand preferences. But you really need to establish uniqueness, and then for the transaction at hand, given each stakeholder's role, you want to minimize the data collected to do the identification and then to authenticate a claim. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure that G2's business is as directly related to the question, so I won't go on and on. Although I've got all sorts of things that I'd love to share that relate to the conversation that's been had. I'll just make two points. One is in the merchant risk world, bad actor businesses, these are deeply syndicated global networks operating in the shadows of a payments ecosystem that has grown exponentially more complicated over the last 10 years. We talked in one of the earlier sessions about the old four-party value chain. Now when we draw the picture of the payments ecosystem, it has 50, 75, 100 modules of different ways to pay, different places to shop, different types of merchants, and many, many blank spaces where it's dark and where bad actors seek to hide. And our job is to try to shine light in those corners. And we actually do it without collecting PII because that's not the business that we're in. But what we're usually trying to do is find the bad actors that are actually hiding behind synthetic front businesses that are pretending to be valid merchants. So that's just one point I think that's germane. And then I did want to just give an example of where anonymity does conflict with merchant acquiring, and that's Bitcoin exchanges or virtual currency exchanges. These are, depends on the country, and I'm not a legal expert, but a varying legal acceptance kind of country by country around the world, but many, many countries, and this is another area where we do work with law enforcement, is taking a close look at them. So in a Bitcoin exchange or a virtual currency exchange, you can use your credit card or cash or a debit card or a payment-to-payment mechanism to procure the anonymous currency and then go to an illegal product site anonymously and procure that illegal product. And unfortunately, that is a lot of how child endangerment is
I mean,
getting.
it's not fully anonymous though. There is the notion of KYC on the ingress into the blockchain.
True.
Yeah.
Good thought. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I have one last thought, if I may, which is, I spent a long time in the military, and a lot of times these days people come up to me and they say, thank you for your service, and that means a lot to me. But there are a lot of ways to serve this country, and don't for a minute think that what you are doing and what these panelists are doing is not service to the country, and indeed, in many ways, service to the world. So until we have a cyber force, we're going to rely on people like those on the stage and those in the audience. And I want to close by saying thank you for your service. Thank you very much. A pleasure. Thank you.